Malik Jordan, a 14-year-old black boy, came to court for one reason: to testify for his aunt in a simple land dispute. But when he tried to stay calm under pressure and let out a quiet breath, a white female officer saw it as disrespect. In front of everyone, she handcuffed him like a criminal. Malik didn't resist. He didn't even cry. And then, his father walked in. A retired Navy SEAL with nothing to prove but everything to protect. What happens when the system silences a child, but his silence speaks louder? Share your thoughts, and let's get into Malik's story. They said it would be quick. In and out. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Just answer what you remember. Then, you can go home. That's what Aunt Clarice told him when they pulled into the courthouse parking lot that morning, the late spring sun already warming the sidewalk like it had something to prove. Malik Jordan, all of 14, sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a manila envelope with both hands, like it might blow away if he let go. He wasn't the defendant. He wasn't in trouble. He kept telling himself that. But there was something about courthouses, how they smelled like old paper and polished tile, how the ceilings stretched high but the air still felt tight, that made even innocent people feel like they'd done something wrong. Clarice had tried to make him feel ready. She told him to sit straight, answer clearly, and whatever he did, don't try to be clever. Let the truth be enough, she said. He'd nodded, even though the knot in his chest didn't go away. The case was simple, or at least it had been until someone decided to make it more than that. A neighbor, white, retired, claimed Clarice had extended her garden a few feet over onto his land. Clarice insisted the opposite, that the strip of soil had always belonged to her. And Malik, years ago, had once filmed the original owner of that land, a kind elderly man pointing to that very space and saying, "That's hers now." The video had lived on his phone until one day it didn't. A bad fall in the kitchen, a cracked screen data lost. What survived was a letter. A short handwritten note that Clarice found just last week in a box of old bills and receipts buried under time. Signed, dated, and quietly powerful. That letter was now in Malik's hands, not in a lawyer's folder or a court exhibit binder, just a piece of paper in a plain envelope held by a boy who still hadn't decided if he was supposed to speak loudly or softly in a courtroom. Clarice had given it to him that morning with both hands and a quiet prayer. Hold on to this baby, and don't give it to nobody unless they ask. Understand he did. He really did. The courthouse door was heavier than it looked. When Malik followed Clarice inside, he felt it pull at his shoulder like it knew he wasn't sure about being there. The hallway beyond was long and lined with framed photos of former judges, none of them smiling. Malik tried not to look at them. He focused on his steps, one then another. Slow, steady. Don't trip. They arrived early, so the courtroom was still half empty when they walked in. Even so, Malik could feel the eyes. Not all at once. Not openly. But in glances that lasted a second too long. Almost everyone inside was white. From the clerks shuffling papers to the officers by the wall, from the opposing attorney seated near the front to the older couple whispering in the gallery. Malik felt like the color of his skin had walked in before he did. He stayed close to Clarice, silent. "Sit here," she whispered, pointing to the second row. "And remember, you're just telling the truth. That's all." Her voice was firm but gentle. She smoothed the back of his jacket before sitting beside him. The courtroom felt colder once he sat down. Not freezing, but cold, like the kind of place where smiles didn't mean kindness. Malik sat still, hands folded over the envelope in his lap, his thumb tracing the sealed flap again and again like a nervous habit he couldn't stop. He tried to listen to the soft murmurs of legal talk up front, but it all blended together. Something about zoning. Something about witness lists. Something about boundaries. None of it felt like it had to do with him. And yet somehow, all of it did. One thing he did notice was the officer standing near the side wall. A white woman, maybe in her 40s, with a buzz cut so tight her scalp caught the light. She stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set like she was guarding something more important than paperwork. Her eyes scanned the room, slow and deliberate, until they landed on him, and stayed. Malik met her stare for a second too long before looking away. He didn't mean to challenge her. He just didn't want to look scared. He told himself she looked at everyone that way. But he knew better. He tried to sit straighter, tried to fold his hands tighter, tried to pretend his skin didn't feel like it was glowing under a spotlight. He could feel sweat start to gather behind his knees. He hoped no one noticed. Clarice leaned close and whispered, "Breathe, baby. You're doing fine." He nodded, but his throat was dry. No one in that room knew what Malik was holding in his hands. They saw a kid, a quiet one, maybe a little nervous, maybe out of place. But no one knew that inside that envelope was a letter that could tilt the whole case. A letter with weight. A letter that said, "This land belongs to her. I give it willingly." Malik wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about how his shoes looked too big, how the bench was too hard, how he didn't know where to look without seeming suspicious. He didn't know that in less than 20 minutes he'd be wearing handcuffs. Not because of what he said, but because he breathed. And in a courtroom built on silence, it turns out some breaths are just too loud. They called his name and the room shifted. Malik Jordan. It wasn't loud. The clerk didn't even look up when she said it, but somehow it echoed, and the echo stuck. Malik stood slowly, the envelope still clutched in his hand. He could feel his palms sweating against the paper, could feel the crease at the corner bending under his grip. That envelope had weight, not from the letter inside, but from everything it carried with it, memories, trust, and now a room full of eyes. He walked to the witness stand like his feet weren't fully his. The floor felt soft in the wrong places and hard where it shouldn't. He tried to remember what Clarice said. Walk steady, speak clearly. Never lose your breath. Don't let them think you're afraid, even if you are. He sat, folded his hands, looked straight ahead. The attorney stood tall in polished white hair and sharp suit. He looked like someone who had never been interrupted in his life. His tone was warm, rehearsed, but behind the smile, Malik could feel something colder. You're Malik, right? Yes, sir. You knew Mr. Holloway, the previous landowner? Yes, sir. You walked the property with him? Yes. Did he tell you who the land belonged to? He said it was Aunt Clarice's. He told me to help her with the garden, said it was hers now. The lawyer nodded slowly like he was pulling strings Malik couldn't see. He stepped closer, resting his fingers lightly on the edge of the jury box, then tilted his head. Well then, let me ask you this. He smiled wider now. How much land do you think a family like yours deserves, Malik? The question dropped like a stone into still water. No gasp, no noise. Just a shift, shoulders tightening, eyes blinking slower, the room settling into a different kind of silence. Malik blinked, unsure if he'd heard it right. He glanced toward Clarice. Her jaw had clenched tight, her hands white-knuckled on the edge of her purse. The judge didn't react at all. Didn't even raise her eyes from her notes. Just let the question hang there like it belonged. I don't know, sir, Malik said quietly. He was trying to keep his voice calm, but it came out dry. Thin. His heart beat loud in his chest, not in panic, but like something rising slow and unwanted. The lawyer chuckled softly, turned and walked a slow half-circle in front of the bench. I suppose that depends, doesn't it? Malik didn't answer. He didn't know how to. The back of his neck burned. And that's when he did it. He took a breath. A slow, steady breath to keep himself from shaking. Then, as his lip trembled ever so slightly, he let it curve just a little. A small, nervous smile. Not defiance, not disrespect. Just the kind of smile a kid makes when he's trying to stop the tears before they start. But Officer Karen Riles didn't see it that way. She had been watching him the whole time, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, weight on one heel. Her eyes hadn't left him since he sat down. She didn't see a scared kid. She saw something else. Something she had already decided he was. She stepped forward, one foot, then another. Each step measured, purposeful. She didn't ask permission. She didn't give warning. Her voice was sharp and loud enough to slice through the courtroom. You think this is funny? Malik flinched. No, ma'am. You smirking, mocking this court? No, ma'am. I wasn't mocking anything, I was just breathing. Riley's turned her head slightly toward the judge. Your Honor, I'm calling this witness in contempt. Clarice's voice cut in from the gallery, shaking. He's a child. He didn't do anything. Sit down, barked the bailiff, stepping in front of her. Judge Blackwell didn't look up. Proceed. And with that, Officer Riles unhooked her cuffs. Malik froze. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes went to Clarice, whose face had gone pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. I said, stand up. Riles ordered, voice loud now. People turned to watch. Hands out where I can see them. I don't care what you didn't. Hands, now. Malik slowly stood, legs stiff. He held out his wrists. The cuffs clicked shut. Click, click, two simple sounds. But in that room they sounded like thunder. Clarice was crying now, silently. Her hands clutched her skirt so tight it wrinkled like paper. No one moved to help. No one said a word. Malik stood, cuffed, his face blank. Not because he didn't feel, but because he felt too much. He looked down at the envelope still clutched in his hand. No one had asked for it. No one cared what it said. And somewhere in the back of the room, a man who hadn't been there a moment ago opened the courtroom door and stepped inside. It happened too fast for anyone to stop it, and yet too slow for anyone to forget. Officer Riles stood tall in the courtroom, hand already on her belt, voice cutting through the stale air like it belonged more to a drill field than a courthouse. Contempt of court, she said. The words didn't boom. They didn't echo. But they landed with the weight of something final, something dangerous, and something Malik realized he couldn't undo. He blinked, startled, unsure if she was speaking to him or someone behind him. But she was already walking, direct, eyes locked, the heavy look of a decision she'd made long before he ever smiled. No, Malik stammered, rising from the witness chair without being asked. His voice cracked, not from guilt, but confusion. No, I wasn't. I was just... You were smirking. Laughing, she snapped. That's not how we behave in court. I wasn't laughing. He pleaded louder now, his voice shaking. I was just trying not to. Enough! She raised one hand. Her other hand reached for the cuffs. The judge said nothing at first. Then, as Riles moved past the counsel tables, Judge Blackwell finally looked up. Her eyes met Riles's, then swept briefly toward Malik, now standing alone at the witness stand, chest rising and falling, hands slightly lifted, not in resistance, but as if to say, "What did I do wrong?" "Proceed," the judge said flatly, then added, "We will maintain order in this courtroom." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The permission was loud enough. "No!" Clarice's voice rose from the gallery like it had been held down too long. She stood up, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. "He's a child. He's done nothing wrong." The bailiff moved immediately. Big, broad, silent. He stepped into her line like a wall. Clarice's shoulders squared, but she stopped because she had to. She wasn't afraid of Riles. She wasn't afraid of the judge. She was afraid of what might happen to Malik if she pushed too hard. So she stood there, fists clenched, breath shaking, tears burning behind her eyes. The room was still, not silent in a peaceful way, silent in the way a room gets when it witnesses something it knows is wrong and chooses to do nothing. Malik stood frozen. Riles reached out, turned him roughly by the arm. He winced. "Put your hands behind your back," she said. "I didn't do anything," he whispered. It wasn't loud enough for her to care, but loud enough for Clarice to hear. And it broke her. He felt the cold steel close around his wrist. First one, then the other. Click, click. The sound wasn't loud, but it shattered something invisible, something called trust, something called safety. The envelope, the one with the letter, the reason he was even there, slipped from his hand and landed on the wooden floor with a soft flap. No one picked it up. Not Riles, not the judge, not the bailiff. No one. Malik's head tilted forward slightly. He didn't cry. He didn't even breathe. He just stood there, cuffed, a 14-year-old boy, shackled for a smile. Clarice was still standing. Her voice was lower now, like something exhausted but refusing to die. "Are you really doing this? Right here in front of all these people? You're caging a child. And not one of you has the spine to say it's wrong." No one answered. A few people shifted in their seats. A few others looked down. One woman in the back wiped her eyes. But no one spoke, because this was court, and in court, silence was safety. Officer Riles pulled Malik gently toward the edge of the room, toward the hallway, toward somewhere he didn't belong. He moved like someone who no longer expected fairness. His eyes were wide but empty. Before they reached the door, he turned his head just slightly. Clarice looked back at him, whispering his name. Not screaming it, not begging, just saying it like a promise. A tether. Malik. And then the door opened, but it wasn't Riles who pushed it. A man stepped through broad shoulders, salt and pepper beard posture straight, like it had been trained not to bend. He wore a simple navy jacket, jeans, and boots, but even in that he carried something that didn't need to be said, a presence, a silence that didn't tremble. He looked first at the officer, then at the cuffs, then at the judge, and finally at the boy, his son. And without raising his voice, without taking another step, he asked the question that no one else had the courage to form. What exactly is my son being arrested for? And just like that, the air in the room changed. Because for the first time that day, someone walked in who didn't need the judge's permission to speak. The door didn't slam open. It didn't creak or rattle. It simply parted softly, almost respectfully, as if even the building knew who was stepping through. For a second, no one turned. The judge was still scribbling in her notes. Officer Riles had one hand on Malik's arm, the other hovering close to her belt. Clarice had finally sat down, her body, trembling eyes glazed with disbelief and helpless fury. But Malik turned, not because of the sound, because of something else, something he felt before he saw. Like a shadow he'd always carried suddenly returning to the light. The man who stepped through the door was taller than anyone in the room, black, broad-shouldered, silent. His boots hit the polished tile with a calm rhythm. He didn't wear a badge or a uniform, no insignia on his jacket. But the way he walked, the way he held his head, the way the room seemed to feel smaller when he entered it, said enough. Malik didn't breathe at first. He didn't have to. He knew. That was his father, Marcus Jordan, the man who had disappeared when Malik was 4. The man Clarice never talked about in anything more than a whisper, and even then only when she thought Malik was asleep. No one had said where he went. No one had expected him to come back. Not like this, not here. But he was here. And Malik, still cuffed, still stunned, watched as something in his chest he didn't know was broken began to shift. Marcus didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Riles. His eyes moved only once down to his son's wrists, bound in cold metal, then up to his face. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Officer Riles straightened, suddenly stiff. She didn't know him. Not by name, but she knew enough. It was in the way he moved, in the way he didn't blink when her hand hovered near her taser, in the steady weight of his gaze. And then she saw it peeking out beneath the cuff of his jacket stretched over the thick skin of his right forearm. The seal trident. Tattooed, faded but clear. A few of the younger officers in the room noticed it too. One leaned toward another, whispered something. Both straightened, suddenly unsure whether they were supposed to step in or stand down. Marcus finally moved. Not quickly, not forcefully, just purposefully. He walked to the front of the courtroom, past Clarice, whose hand rose to her mouth in a quiet gasp, past the silent gallery, past the attorney who had asked Malik how much land a boy like him deserved. He reached the clerk's desk. The woman behind it hesitated, eyes wide, lips parting like she meant to ask something but forgot what. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed something small, flat, square, dark leather. He placed it gently on the desk. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. The clerk blinked. She looked down at the object, then up at him. His voice, when it came, was low, steady. "My name is Marcus Jordan, retired Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEAL." That was all. No anger, no demand, no accusation. But the energy in the room shifted. Like someone had flipped a switch that everyone had forgotten was even there. Judge Blackwell paused. Her pen stopped moving. Her chin lifted half an inch. Clarice stood again, slowly this time. She looked at Marcus like she couldn't quite believe he was real. "Marcus," she whispered. She hadn't said his name aloud in 10 years. Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. There was only recognition. A nod that said, "We'll talk later." Then his gaze returned to Malik. Still cuffed, still silent, still a child. He stepped forward this time, turning directly to face Officer Riles. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move his hands. But his words, when they came, landed like a command. "Take those off." Riles didn't move. Judge Blackwell cleared her throat, but said nothing. Marcus's eyes didn't leave Riles. His voice dropped half a tone quieter, somehow heavier. "I'm not asking again." The room held its breath. And for the first time, Officer Riles blinked, because she realized something important. This wasn't just a father. This wasn't just a man. This was someone who had been trained to step into chaos and remain unshaken. Someone who had spent years walking into places worse than this and returning in one piece. Someone who didn't bluff. And for the first time since Malik had entered that courtroom, someone was standing between him and the system with no fear. With no permission. Only purpose. The courtroom didn't make a sound, but the air inside it changed. You could almost feel it like a hush that wasn't about quiet, but about gravity. All eyes had dropped to what Marcus had placed on the clerk's table. It wasn't large. It wasn't flashy. But somehow it took up more space than it should have. A worn leather case had been opened. Inside one card. Plain, direct. Chief Marcus Jordan, SEAL Team 6, retired. It didn't shout. It didn't have to. At the back of the room, a young deputy leaned toward his partner and murmured just above a whisper, "He's the one from the Yemen rescue." The other officer froze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Everyone in uniform had heard some version of the story. Hostages a compound deep in insurgent territory. No shots fired, no lives lost. The mission was never officially confirmed, but Marcus Jordan's name had floated around like smoke from a controlled burn. Quiet, effective, unstoppable. And now that name was sitting quietly in the middle of this courtroom on a folded card that had just shifted the balance of power. Officer Riles was still standing beside Malik, but her posture had changed. Her shoulders had dropped just slightly. Her hands, once stiff and ready now, hovered uncertainly. She wasn't sure if she should let go of the boy or double down. She looked at Marcus. He hadn't moved. His voice came again quiet and steady. "You handcuffed a witness, a child, in front of a courtroom, before hearing a single word of what he brought. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, one that didn't need volume to carry." The judge glanced up, lips pressing into a tight line. She was about to speak, probably something about discretion or decorum, but Marcus cut through that silence again, not louder, just deeper. "You watched it happen." That was when Malik felt it, not just the eyes on him, but the shift inside him. All that shame that had crawled into his chest when the cuffs snapped around his wrists. Suddenly, it didn't sit the same. It loosened, like it didn't belong there anymore. His father was here, and not just here to stand next to him, but to see him, to speak for him when no one else had. Malik glanced down at the floor. The envelope with the letter was still there, crumpled slightly, lying beside the leg of the witness stand. He looked up at Marcus and gave a barely visible nod. "It's there," he said quietly. The letter. Marcus turned back to the clerk. His next words were calm but absolute. "Pick up that envelope, please." The woman hesitated, then moved carefully like the floor might shift beneath her. She picked up the envelope and held it out toward Marcus. But he didn't take it. He simply gestured, "Give it to the judge." For a moment, the room seemed to wait for Judge Blackwell to object. But she didn't. Her fingers moved over the card again, reading the name a second time. It felt familiar, not just from the badge or the title, but from somewhere deeper in her past. And then she remembered. Years ago, there had been a case sealed so fast she barely had time to review the first page. The plaintiff was redacted the mission, scrubbed the names erased, but there had been a whisper in the paperwork. A soldier wronged. A Jordan. It couldn't be him. But now she wasn't so sure. The envelope landed gently on her bench. She opened it without a word. Clarice, who had remained frozen this whole time, took a slow step forward. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But her eyes flickered from the judge to the card, then finally back to Marcus. "Marcus," she said, not loudly, like she was still checking whether he was really there, whether this moment was real. He didn't respond, just nodded once, quiet and firm. Then he turned back to Malik. He crouched slightly, coming eye level with the boy. Not to draw attention, not to create drama, but to connect. To make sure the only voice that mattered now belonged to his son. "You did good," he said simply. "Now let them listen." Malik blinked once, then again. That tightness in his chest, it wasn't fear anymore. It was something else. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Or just the rare feeling of being protected in a place where you were never meant to feel safe. And then, with her fingers trembling just slightly, Judge Blackwell began to read. Not from a legal brief, not from prepared arguments, but from a letter. Handwritten. Forgotten in an old box. Carried by a boy they thought was too young to matter. And for the first time in that courtroom, silence didn't mean dismissal. It meant everyone was listening. The judge held the envelope like it carried weight beyond what paper should. Her fingers paused at the flap as if she knew that once she opened it, the courtroom would not return to what it was before. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply stepped back and stood behind Malik, a quiet presence that seemed to grow taller with each breath his son took. Clarice spoke up, her voice steady but charged. That letter, she said, was found in the old owner's storage chest. We were cleaning it out after he passed. It had my name on it, Clarice Freeman. It's signed. It proves he gave me that strip of land as part of a verbal agreement years before he died. There was a silence after her words that felt almost holy. Even the judge sat straighter. The envelope was finally opened, and inside was a folded letter, yellowed slightly at the edges. Ink faded but clear. Judge Blackwell read aloud, "To Clarice. This letter is just a formality for the lawyers in case they come knocking. You've taken care of the backlot longer than anyone ever bothered to. I said it to your face, but I'm writing it now too, it's yours. You grow food on it, you keep it clean, and frankly, it should have been signed over years ago. I'm just slow." The judge blinked once, then twice. She read on. "There's no need for fences between people who share the land in good faith. Let this letter be the only boundary you need." At the bottom, a signature, handwritten, verified against court records. Clarice breathed in sharply. Malik lowered his eyes, not out of shame this time, but in quiet release, as if the weight he had carried all day had finally been placed somewhere it belonged. Across the room, the plaintiff's lawyer shifted in his seat. His lips pressed thin. The smirk from earlier had vanished. His face had gone pale beneath the courtroom lights, and he was no longer looking at Malik or Clarice or even the judge. He was staring at the letter like it had personally betrayed him. Because it had. This wasn't just testimony anymore. This was evidence. Real, binding, written truth. Not hearsay. Not interpretation. A document that cut through hours of legal maneuvering with one simple truth: Clarice hadn't taken anything. She had been given it. Years ago. In writing. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His voice came soft almost beneath the buzz of the fluorescent lights. He carried more truth in his pocket than this court did on its walls. The words echoed. Not loud, but they traveled. You could feel the sting land somewhere in the wood panels, in the judge's silence, in the way Officer Riles no longer looked anyone in the eye. Judge Blackwell cleared her throat. Not to cover her discomfort, but to take hold of it. "This letter," she said, raising it slightly, "is now entered into the official record as Defense Exhibit A. It will be reviewed fully. And unless the plaintiff's counsel has a compelling objection," the opposing attorney rose, trying to find something to hold on to. "Your Honor, even if this letter is authentic," it is the judge cut in, "and verified. We'll confirm with the signature archive, but initial review supports its legitimacy. You may continue, but understand that this shifts the weight of your argument." Malik's eyes met his father's. It was the first time he had seen his father truly still. Not tense, not braced, just at ease. And maybe that was the most powerful moment of all, because for the first time since he walked through those courtroom doors, Malik wasn't the only one carrying the truth. It had finally landed in the right hands. And for once, everyone in that room had no choice but to see it. No yelling, no outburst. Just a single sheet of paper, forgotten dusty, left in a box, and a boy who believed it mattered. Now so did everyone else. For a long moment, Officer Riles didn't move. She stood exactly where she had when she first reached for the cuffs, as if part of her still believed the courtroom would side with her, would see what she saw, believe what she believed. But that moment had passed. Now every eye was either looking at the judge, at the letter on her bench, or at Riles herself. "I was following protocol," she said, her voice tight. He smiled during testimony. "I thought Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You thought a black child breathing was a threat." The silence that followed wasn't shocked. It was recognition. The kind of stillness that settles not when something new is said, but when something long known is finally spoken aloud. Riley's opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her fingers fidgeted near her holster, then dropped. She looked around the courtroom, maybe expecting backup, a glance of support, a nod from someone in uniform. But no one moved. A young bailiff in this corner removed his earpiece slowly and stepped backward, just one quiet pace, putting space between himself and the officer who moments ago had been the one giving orders. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it said enough. The balance had shifted. Judge Blackwell adjusted the spectacles that had slipped down her nose. She didn't look angry. She looked done. "Officer Riles," she said calmly, You are hereby suspended from participating in the remainder of this session. A formal incident report will be filed. Please remove yourself from the courtroom until further notice. Riley blinked. It took her a moment to register that she was no longer the one making decisions. The hand that had grabbed Malik now twitched slightly at her side, not with authority, but with hesitation. She gave one last glance at Marcus, then at the judge, and finally at Malik. He didn't look away. Malik wasn't glaring. He wasn't triumphant. He was just still. The kind of stillness that comes when you stop asking for permission to exist. That look that silence held more weight than any argument he could have made. And Riles seemed to know it. Without another word, she turned, stepped past the gallery, and left the room. Her footsteps were muffled by the carpet, but they sounded louder than they should have. Not because of volume, but because of finality. As the door closed behind her, the courtroom exhaled. It wasn't a sigh of relief. It was something heavier, like a truth being released after too long kept in. Judge Blackwell looked down at the letter once more, then back at Malik. He hadn't spoken much since his testimony began. But everything about him had changed. His shoulders were straighter now, not because he'd grown, but because the room had finally stopped shrinking around him. In that stillness, Clarice reached for his hand. He let her hold it, but his eyes stayed on the judge. There was no fear there anymore, just clarity. The letter had been read. The cuffs were gone. Officer Riles was no longer in the room. And yet something still hung in the air, something heavy and unfinished, like the weight of a question no one had dared to ask out loud. Judge Blackwell sat motionless for a few seconds, her fingers grazing the edges of the signed letter that now sat like a quiet flame on the bench. She glanced up, her eyes not stern, but searching, and let her voice carry gently across the room. "Malik," she said, "would you like to say anything?" At first, Malik didn't move. The question itself seemed to float above him, too big, too unexpected. His eyes shifted slightly, not to the judge, but to his father, who stood behind him, like a shadow of calm, unmoved. Marcus didn't nod, didn't push. Just let the silence wrap around his son like a coat Malik had to choose to wear on his own. The boy stood, slowly. There was no dramatic rustle, no call for attention. He didn't need it, because by now the whole room was listening, really listening. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make the quiet shiver. "I've been told. Silence is safe." He began his words careful and steady, almost like he'd rehearsed them inside his own head 100 times before today. But silence didn't help me today. He paused, looked down, not out of shame, out of truth. Then he looked back up. It erased me. There it was. The room didn't gasp. No one made a sound. But you could feel it, like oxygen had been replaced by something deeper, something heavier. A truth that sat on people's shoulders and didn't ask permission to stay. A woman in the second row reached slowly for her purse, only to stop and leave it there. A man near the back shook his head, not in disagreement, but in the quiet way someone does when regret brushes against their spine. Even the clerk had stopped writing. Marcus didn't move. But if you looked close enough, you might have seen the way his jaw relaxed just slightly, as if something inside him had loosened. Not pride, not yet, but something even more rare, peace. Malik didn't go on. He didn't need to. That sentence was more than enough. And this time, the silence that followed wasn't the kind that ignored him. It wasn't the cold, practiced silence of systems pretending they don't see. It was respect. Judge Blackwell leaned forward, the lines on her face deepening with thought. She didn't touch the gavel. She didn't call for order. Instead, she met Malik's eyes and said 3 words, just 3. "You were seen." The boy didn't smile, but his breathing changed. The kind of breath that says, "I can stand here now." The kind that fills your lungs when the weight starts to lift. Clarice reached over her hand, finding his, not to pull him back, not to protect him, but simply to say, "I see it too." And in the back of the room, a man who had once vanished from his son's life stood quietly, watching the boy he came back for step fully into the light. Whatever came next, one thing was certain. Malik Jordan had found his voice, and this time the world stayed quiet to hear it. That evening, long after the courtroom had emptied, when the lights above the bench had dimmed, and the chatter of the day was nothing but a faint memory, Judge Eleanor Blackwell sat alone in her chambers. The silence was different now. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't comfortable either. It was reflective, the kind of silence that arrives only when truth has been spoken and there's nowhere left to hide from it. She pulled out an old metal drawer from the file cabinet behind her desk, one rarely touched in recent years. Her fingers hesitated only briefly before she slid out a manila folder, its corners softened by time. The name on the tab read D. Jordan, 2001. She didn't open it right away. For a moment, her hands just rested on the cover, remembering. David Jordan, Marcus's father. He'd stood in front of her courtroom more than 2 decades ago, accused of stealing tools from a local warehouse where he had worked for 17 years. No prior convictions, no history of violence, just the wrong skin tone in a town where justice hadn't always worn its robe evenly. The evidence had been weak, the testimony thinner than paper, but she'd let it move forward. She hadn't stopped it. She hadn't spoken up. At the time, she'd told herself it wasn't her job to question the officers, just to uphold the rules as written. But tonight, looking at that folder, she no longer heard rules. She heard silence, the same kind Malik had broken today. She opened the file. The yellowed pages crinkled beneath her fingers. And there it was, her own signature approving the continuation of a case that never should have gone to trial. He had lost his job, lost his standing. Died just 3 years later, Marcus barely in his teens. Eleanor closed the folder slowly, her lips pressed into a line. She reached for a blank document, slid it into her typewriter, and began to type with a deliberateness she hadn't felt in years. Request for internal review of Officer Karen Riles, filed by Judge Eleanor Blackwell. She paused, then added another line not required by procedure but demanded by conscience. Re-past conduct patterns and my failure to intervene in 2001. It was the first time in her career she had ever submitted a report that reflected back on herself. Not from the bench, not in judgment, but from a place that finally understood what justice had missed. When she finished, she didn't feel lighter. This wasn't redemption. It wasn't a correction that could undo what had already passed. But it was something rare in that building, a judge not defending the system, but joining those who had once been dismissed by it. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor Blackwell was no longer just part of the law. She was finally standing on the side of it. The sun was low by the time the courthouse doors finally swung open again. The heavy wood groaned just enough to remind everyone still inside that some doors, even when opened, leave weight behind. Marcus Jordan stepped out first, tall and steady, his silhouette cutting a defined line across the soft orange glow. Malik followed beside him, not behind him, and certainly not beneath him, just beside him. 2 sets of feet hit the concrete in a slow rhythm, like the ending of a song that had been playing long before anyone realized it had music. The air outside felt different. Not freer, not yet, but clearer. Malik looked up at his father. It had been years too many for a boy to go without this kind of closeness, this kind of grounding. He didn't know if it would last. He didn't even know what to call it. But in that moment, he didn't need to name it. He just asked, soft and almost shy, "Are you coming home tonight?" Marcus didn't pause. He didn't fumble for an answer or lean into excuses. He simply nodded, once the kind of nod that said more than a speech ever could. "Before dark, I promise." Malik let the words sit for a moment like he was weighing them in his hands. He didn't reply, not with words. Just a quiet breath that was lighter than the last one he'd taken inside that courtroom. Behind them, Clarice stood still on the courthouse steps, her arms wrapped gently around herself. She had spent years carrying both Malik's burdens and her own, never asking for help, never expecting it. But now, for the first time, she let herself exhale, not out of relief, but from the release that comes when you're no longer fighting alone. She watched them walk together, father and son, side by side, into the golden spill of sunset. The light cast long-reaching shadows ahead of them, like the day itself was leaning forward, trying to keep them in its glow just a little longer. Inside the courthouse, a janitor was wiping down the wooden benches, the echo of a soft cloth on hard surface mixing with the distant hum of a vending machine. Everything had returned to order, or at least the appearance of it. But some echoes don't fade so easily. At the far end of the hallway near the community board where flyers for local events and missing pets usually hung, a new photo had just been pinned up. It wasn't posed. It wasn't polished. It was a still frame captured from earlier that day, Malik standing in handcuffs, lips pressed together, eyes staring forward unflinching. Next to it was a quote hastily printed and taped. "Silence didn't help me today, it erased me." A few feet away, a boy no older than 8 stood next to his mother. He had been in the gallery that day, mostly silent, tucked into her side, watching with wide eyes but saying nothing. Until now. "Mom?" he asked, tugging her sleeve. "Can I speak to?" The woman didn't look at the photo. She didn't need to. She looked down at her son, really looked, and saw something different in him. A question, yes, but also a need. A quiet, firm knowing that he should be heard. She knelt beside him, placing one hand on his chest. "You already are," she said. Across town, Judge Eleanor Blackwell sat at her kitchen table, the weight of the day still hanging in her shoulders. She didn't reach for wine. She didn't turn on the TV. She sat with the silence she used to avoid, and for once, let it speak. Her review request had been filed. A second one, too. This one internal. About a ruling from years ago, one involving David Jordan, the father of the man she saw in court today. Tonight, she wasn't the law. She was simply a woman sitting with what she had allowed and what she could still undo. And somewhere not far from that same table, in a modest house with a flickering porch light, Marcus Jordan unpacked a small duffel bag. It had patches from places no child would ever be allowed to visit, medals tucked deep in the corners, and photos he hadn't looked at in over a decade. He didn't say much, just took a folded blanket and laid it across Malik's bed before walking quietly to the living room and sitting down on the couch where he could see the front door. The boy was already asleep, but Marcus stayed awake because sometimes keeping a promise meant nothing more than being there when you said you would. Outside, the sky darkened, but for once not everything did. Because one child stood up, because one judge listened, because one father came home before dark. Sometimes it only takes one voice to change everything. And today, that voice belonged to a boy who didn't shout, didn't fight, but still made the whole courtroom listen. Malik's story isn't just about injustice. It's about courage. It's about a child who showed up, a father who kept his promise, and a moment when silence finally gave way to truth. This story reminds us that justice isn't always loud, but it's always worth standing up for. If this story touched you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more powerful stories that shine a light where it's long been dark. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content that doesn't just tell a story, but leaves something behind. We're Mr. Mac Stories, where every story remembers what others forget.